When the PS3 came out in 2006, its launch lineup of titles left something to be desired. I think many of us remember that old meme, PS3 has no games. While we did get upgraded versions of multi-platform games, the launch titles made for the ground up for the system were rather scant. Remember that one game with the giant enemy crab? Yeah, that was a PS3 launch game, do you even remember that? But luckily, the PS3 did have one standout title that actually managed to be kind of a killer app for the struggling $600 George Foreman grill, and that was Resistance: Fall of Man. I gotta say, this is a series I've been meaning to eventually look at, but I guess I kinda did miss the boat when it was new. But I did manage to get my hands on the 3 main PS3 installments, so I figured maybe now would be a good time to look at them. Developed by Insomniac, who by this point had already made a name for themselves for creating the Spyro trilogy on PS1 and the Ratchet & Clank series, Resistance is an alternate history first-person shooter set in the year 1951. A bizarre parasitic alien race known as the Chimera have emerged from Russia and have all but taken over Europe. Humans not killed by the Chimera have been captured and converted into Chimera themselves, and the British Army is having a hard time fighting back this alien menace. As a result, the British Army reluctantly calls in help from the American 1st Ranger Division, and it's here we meet our protagonist Nathan Hale, a real American Chad Thundercock who's clearly the only one capable of saving the day. At first glance, it looks like your typical World War II shooty bang-bang game, released during a time when over half of the FPS genre was nothing but World War II shooty bang-bang games. But what really helped separate this from its contemporaries was its exclusive use of aliens as enemies, and also the unique weapons, which I guess is a good place to start this review. On top of your standard issue army rifle, sniper rifle, rocket launcher, and good old-fashioned American shotgun, you'll also happen across the Chimera's bullseye weapon, which, when using the alternate fire button, will allow you to tag an enemy with a tracker for your regular bullets for a short time, or until the enemy is dead. Yeah, that's right, I basically just said homing bullets. The auger allows you to shoot enemies through walls, which makes the bullets stronger coming out the other end, and the alternate fire will put up an energy shield that can block enemy fire for a short time. The Hedgehog grenade releases sharp spikes upon detonation and can hit anything in every which way, and the Hailstorm uses ricocheting bullets, and its alternate fire mode fires a turret-like stream of bullets while in midair. And there are even more weapons that can be unlocked after completing the roughly 10-hour campaign. Like I always say with these first-person shooters, you're bound to find at least 1 or 2 favorites. Insomniac really made a name for themselves for fun, exotic guns with the Ratchet & Clank games, and it's awesome to see them continue that tradition here. The one odd exclusion that really stuck out to me is that the game doesn't give you a pistol. That's like a go-to starter weapon for any FPS, but its absence here is felt, and it's kinda weird. One thing I was definitely not expecting to see from such an early-era PS3 game was it running at a surprisingly consistent 60 frames per second. Most Sony-published games for the system, even the ones made by their crown jewel Naughty Dog, would tend to stick to the safe bet of only 30 frames per second, so seeing it run at twice that amount was really surprising for a launch game of all things. Granted, Resistance only outputs at 720p, but still, it's nice to see Insomniac put forth the extra effort to have a smooth-running game. And there were hardly any frame drops at all. The only time I ever saw any sort of performance dip was when there was a lot of action going on screen, and even then it was pretty brief. And there was hardly any screen tear at all, and that's something that even games that came later in the system's life would have trouble avoiding. Does anybody remember Never Dead? 'Cause I remember. Oh boy, do I remember. Though it might have more to do with the fact that Insomniac is using an engine that actually plays nice with the PS3's infamously tricky architecture. And also worth mentioning, it's a pretty good-looking game for 2006. It's not muddy-looking at all, like so many other games after this tend to look. It's a sharp-looking, bombed-out England you'll be running and gunning through. A special mention needs to go to the animation quality. You can see the Chimera's heat regulation tubes come off and swing about when they're killed, and it's a nice touch. This was around the time Insomniac really started to take their animation and creature designs to the next level. In terms of presentation and performance, they really put their best foot forward here. And you're gonna need all the firepower you can get your hands on, because the Chimera will put up a real fight. Just playing the game on the default medium setting, I kinda got my ass handed to me. For starters, the enemy AI is a dangerous combination of aggressive and smart. Chimera have the ability to use cover and avoid oncoming gunfire just as much as you do, and to put it simply, these things want you dead. I'm not ashamed to admit that I died a handful of times on the game's opening act, half due to the aggressive enemies, and the other half because of the way the game handles health. You get 4 segments of health, and as long as the segment isn't depleted entirely, it'll regenerate after a few seconds. So there will be a few moments where you'll need to stop and let your health regenerate before continuing, but I suppose that's not too different from how games today do it. There are health pickups you can find to recover lost health sections, so it's not like the game completely leaves you high and dry, but after going through so many firefights, they can really start to feel like a rare commodity. There's no way to increase how many segments of health you have, and enemies can tear through all of your health in no time flat if you're too exposed. Or if that enemy also happens to be using that gun that shoots through walls too. Yeah, you can shoot through walls with the auger rifle, and so can they. In other words, you're gonna die. A lot. These factors by themselves can make a game challenging, but what I found really took it from challenging to outright frustrating at times was the game's checkpoint system. Normally you think a game would checkpoint you after completing a particularly challenging shootout, but this game loves to challenge you with 2 or 3 of these at a time before giving you one. You'll be fighting an onslaught of clever enemies, sometimes only surviving by the skin of your teeth, and have to press on without the game giving you another checkpoint. And many of those times, they won't even give you any healing items. Now, granted, the game doesn't always do this, but when it does happen, it's frustrating as all hell and honestly a bit demoralizing. My favorite is when you haven't hit a checkpoint yet and respawn all the way back to the beginning of the level and have to sit through the unskippable introductory cutscene again. I don't know, maybe more recent games have spoiled me with more generous checkpoint systems, but when it gets hard, it gets fucking hard. I wish I could say the frustrations end there, but sadly I have another. There are several different enemy types aside from the standard Chimera grunt, like these ones that can jump off of walls really quickly and be a real pain in the ass to hit. There's also these zombie-like enemies that can latch onto you, forcing you to shake the controller to get them off of you. They're not too frustrating, but it does highlight that Sony really wanted to show off those motion controls in their fancy 6-axis controllers, but thankfully you can turn off the motion controls in the options menu. And then there's those Chimeran death tanks that can only be hit on their huge glowing weak spot on their back, wherein you have to sneak around them to hit them, or else run the risk of getting turned into Swiss cheese. There's even a moment about 3/4 of the way through the game where you have to fight this thing as a boss, and it can hit you through even the smallest opening in the cover you're using. But what I can say are a lot of fun, oddly enough, are the vehicle segments. They're brief little stages where you drive either a turret car, a tank, or a spider-legged mech, and either plow through hordes of enemies, or take out enemy strongholds to open gates. These little segments don't last too long and aren't as frustrating as some of the other levels in the game, and can genuinely be a lot of fun. And frankly, the game as a whole would honestly be a whole lot more fun if they had dialed back the difficulty just a bit, or at least made the checkpoint system more forgiving. I know I keep going back to that, but I really think that's the biggest thing holding this game back from being an absolute must-play. If it were a more balanced game, then it would be a fairly rudimentary shooter with a fun premise, interesting enemy designs, and fun weapons, and that by itself would be worth the price of admission. As it stands, truth be told, even with how frustrating the game gets, I still find it fun enough to where I can still kinda recommend checking it out. It's not the most expensive game in the world, and it still has its moments for sure. I think this review ended up being a lot shorter than my other videos, but there's not a whole lot to discuss with this first game. The game's story doesn't really evolve much past the stop the aliens setup, but it does leave little hanging threads that the sequel can do something with. I still haven't played them at the time I'm making this review, but I'm hoping they flesh those plot elements out more, and judging by the second game's box art, it kinda looks like they do. It lays a solid enough groundwork for a series, and it can be genuinely a lot of fun at times, but it's held back by some incredibly frustrating moments. I can only really recommend it to people looking for a super hardcore shooter experience that isn't afraid to kick you in the nuts and take your lunch money. There's definitely room for improvement, and I'm hoping the sequel sees this opportunity to improve on what's here. And I suppose when we return to the Resistance series, we'll see if they did.